I thought today, to start our time of teaching, I would put something very scary up on the screen for you. Something that is terrifying. It's scarier than zombies. It's scarier than monsters. It's scarier than ghosts. Some of you, it's scarier than clowns. I mean, it's something we all find terrifying. Jim, do you want to show them what it is? It's 1 Peter 3:15, which says, "But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect." And this is terrifying for so many of us because it tells us right there, if we truly cherish Jesus in our hearts as Lord, as our master, as the one who sets the agenda for our entire lives, then we will always be prepared to tell people about Jesus. What this means is that as people of faith, we are to always be prepared to tell the story of Jesus, who he is, what he's done for the world, what he has done for us. And so what we see here, this is one of these verses that instructs followers of Jesus to be about the big E, evangelism. And that's really the scary thing, right? Now, we are commanded here to always be prepared to do it, to tell people about our faith in Jesus Christ. Now, why do I bring something so scary to you on this January morning? Well, it's Mike Steiner's fault. There he is. If you're scared to talk about evangelism today, blame Mike. Not really. But it is because a couple weeks ago when Mike was filling in for me when I was on vacation, he did mention something. Yeah, I saw the video and I was blessed by it, and I hope all of you who were here that Sunday were blessed as well. And if you missed it, you can still find the video on our YouTube channel. You can go watch it there. But as I watched it, Mike was very honest about something. He was talking about different things we're scared of or that we're afraid of. And one of the things he says he's afraid of is evangelism, telling other people about his faith in Jesus Christ. And in a wonderful moment of honesty, he admitted because of that fear, he doesn't do it as often as he feels he should. And I like that moment of honesty because if we're all honest, most of us could say the same. You know, we're just right there with Mike. We're afraid of evangelism, so we don't do it as often as we know we should. So when we talk about evangelism, there's always this sense of guilt, right? Who here, has already felt like, oh, evangelism, guilt, right? Because we haven't shared our faith the way God has instructed us to, and we feel guilty about that because we've kind of disobeyed God. So I got thinking about that this week. If our fear keeps us from evangelizing, why is it that we are so afraid of? Why are we so afraid to share the story of the greatest thing that we have ever experienced? That being the knowledge that God loved us so much that he sent Jesus into this world to die on the cross to pay the penalty for my sins, and in doing so taking his righteousness and giving it to me while he's taking away my unrighteousness so that I might be forgiven of all my sins and have the promise of eternal life with God. It's the greatest thing. Why are we afraid to share that message? And as I thought about it, I realized that one of the reasons we are afraid is that there's always some level of challenge when we are sharing our faith. Isn't there? Because when we go and we want to tell somebody else about Jesus, we are in a spiritual battle there. The Holy Spirit of God is using us and working in us and through our words to share the news of his gospel of salvation with somebody who doesn't know it. Somebody who doesn't have it. And so what's going to happen then? Well, the devil is going to rise up. And we talked about this last week, right? The devil always rises to counter good that God is doing. And so the devil's going to rise up and he's going to use whatever influence he has with us to discourage us from sharing our faith. And so he's going to tempt us away from talking about Jesus. He's going to tempt us away from being obedient to God in this task. And he's going to do it by reminding us, well, you might get laughed at. You might make the other person mad. You might be rejected by the other person. You see, the devil's going to tell all those things to us to tempt us away from telling other people about Jesus. So there's that spiritual battle going on that makes sharing our faith a challenge or a risk or difficult sometimes. And that's one of the reasons I think we're fearful of telling people about Jesus. But as I thought about it, I think there are other reasons for it. And one of the reasons we are afraid to evangelize is that we make it harder than it needs to be. In our head, we make telling people about Jesus harder. And that's on us. That's our fault. We do that. See, we compartmentalize evangelism and we institutionalize it and make it this thing, right? Evangelism. And it becomes this thing in our heads. And that takes it to this new level of difficulty. And then we're afraid to do it because we made it so difficult. Well, what do I mean? Well, I mean, sharing our faith doesn't have to be difficult like that. What is necessary is for us to change the picture in our heads of what it means to evangelize. Because what picture comes in our minds when I say evangelize, when I say share your faith? If you're like most people, evangelism in your mind is being ready to meet that person who sits next to you on the airplane, or that person that you encounter in the grocery store line. And it means being bold enough to start a conversation. And it means being bold and practiced enough to direct that conversation towards spiritual things. And it means being bold and gutsy enough to finally say the J word, Jesus, into that conversation. And it means being bold and smart enough to walk that person through the perfect evangelistic presentation with all the right memorized Bible verses. And it means being bold and clever enough to get that acknowledgement of conversion. And it means being bold and victorious enough to be able to say that sinner's prayer with that person, and then you're done. You've evangelized. You see, in our minds, that's what evangelism is. In our minds, that's being prepared to tell of the hope we have. That's preaching the word so that others believe and are saved. And to some degree, you should be prepared to do that, because you never know when God's just going to pick you up and drop you in a situation like that, and you should probably be prepared to be used by God there. But if we're honest, most of us aren't going to be in that situation. Most of us, even if we practiced, aren't going to be skilled at seizing that sort of opportunity like that. Now, some will be. God will see to it. But most of us won't be. I remember my first evangelism class that I had way back at Geneva College when I was a junior. I took an evangelism class with Dr. Dean Smith, who was the chair of our Bible department there. And I had an opening in my class schedule that semester. And this evangelism class wasn't required for graduation, wasn't required for my major, but I had space. And I wanted to learn about it. So I said, I'm going to take that class. I'm going to be ready. I'm going to be prepared, right? So I take this class. And I remember reading several books in which the authors told story after story after story after story, in which they are the ones sitting on the airplane, or meeting the person in the grocery store line, or sitting next to somebody at a baseball game. And they just seemingly without effort talk about how they started this conversation. And they were just masters at directing these conversations toward things about Jesus. And by the end of their experience, they had led a mini revival, seemingly without any effort whatsoever, in which at least one, sometimes several people came to faith in Jesus Christ. And it seemed by their stories in this book that they were doing this everywhere they went, all the time. This was them. And I remember reading those books and being encouraged and inspired that, yeah, maybe one day that could be me. But really having to acknowledge that small voice in my head that was saying, Mark, that's not you. That's really not the type of person God made you to be. That's just not who you are. And that voice was right. You see, not all people are going to be really great at evangelizing in that way, in that sort of context. In fact, most of us won't be. But some will. I remember way back in 2002, I can't believe it was that long ago, when I was visiting a friend from college in San Antonio. And my friend, she had a roommate that she shared an apartment with. And so that roommate came out to dinner with us one evening. And it was a busy night, and so we were in a restaurant. We had to wait for our table, so we were sitting in a little waiting area all together. And this roommate, I don't remember her name. I don't even remember what she looked like, to be honest. But I remember this. As we were sitting there, she just strikes up this conversation with this older couple that's sitting there next to us, waiting for their table as well. And before I know it, she's talking to them, saying all sorts of things to these people about Jesus. And I was just floored, to the point where I still remember to this day. How was she able to do that? Right? We all want to be able to do that. See, God will call some people to be able to share their faith like that. And often we, the rest of us, fear evangelism because we think, well, that's who you got to be in order to evangelize right. So we make it difficult in our heads by believing that that's who we need to be to evangelize successfully. But most of us know we're not that type of people. Get this. To share our faith, most of us don't have to be those type of people. God commands everyone who follows Jesus to be out there sharing faith with people who don't yet know him. But he doesn't command us to share our faith in that way. He doesn't say, this is how it's done, right? We just have that in our head. And I think that's the reason so many people of faith neglect to share our faith, to tell people about our faith in Jesus. We think it's got to be done in that sort of scenario I've been describing. And most of us feel, we maybe even know, that's not who we are. So we just kind of give up. We declare, oh, well, evangelism mustn't be for me. It's not my thing. It must be somebody else's task. Many of us have thought that. But while the New Testament does teach that some will be empowered by the Holy Spirit to share their faith in these far-reaching ways, and perhaps the greatest example we know of is Billy Graham, we are all told, every follower of Jesus is commanded to tell the world about Jesus. There's no out here. So if you're sitting in your pew and you're thinking, well, I'm just not an evangelist. Pastor, please don't talk to me about being an evangelist. It's not who I am. I have maybe some awkward news for you. God doesn't leave that option for you. If that's your attitude, then you're outright defying God. You're knowingly and intentionally defying him, and that's sin, ladies and gentlemen. That's rebellion. And maybe you've never thought about a failure to talk to other people about Jesus as sin, but it kind of is, because in Mark 16:15, put it up there for us, Jim. Jesus is talking to all his followers, the resurrected Jesus. He says, go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. You thought I was going to put up Matthew 28 there, didn't you? But I went to Mark for this one. Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all the people. He says, you've got to preach to everyone. It's a mandate. It's a command. Now, you can argue with me, but you can't argue with the Son of God, well, at least not successfully. Jesus' expectation of all of us as his followers is that we're going to be telling other people about how great he is and the things that he's done. And that's why so many of us feel so guilty, because we're not doing it, because we know we're not those people who can lead that waitress to Christ before the check comes. We don't do that kind of evangelism. And since that's what evangelism is in our minds, we just don't do anything. But evangelism doesn't have to be that difficult. It doesn't have to be that scary. We make it that difficult, but it doesn't have to be. There's a much more realistic way of viewing this idea of sharing your faith. You can be obedient to Jesus and sharing your faith without having to miraculously transform into the next Billy Graham, which is good news for all of us. True, it will require some things of you, but here's the good news. It's all stuff that we are capable of. It's all stuff we have. So if you want to get rid of the guilt over not telling enough people about Jesus, if you really want to be out there and lead other people to the salvation and the freedom that you have found in your faith in Christ, well, there are some things that are going to be required of you. But they're simple things. The first requirement, evangelism requires time and intentionality. We have to be intentional. This is where it starts. And it's right here at the very beginning where most of us fail. Telling others about your faith requires that you are intentional about forming relationships and friendships with people who might be a little bit further away from God, who don't know Jesus, who don't follow Jesus. You see, if you aren't making the effort to spend time with people who don't know Jesus, then you're never going to be able to have a friendly conversation with people about Jesus, because you don't know them. So if we're not intentional about forming these types of relationships, then we're being intentional about failing. We're being intentional about not sharing our faith. We're being intentional about disobeying God. You see, there's the choice. There's the decision we make, whether we're consciously aware of it or not. You see, when it comes to sharing faith, most of the time we think of going from 1 to 100 all in one leap, right? 1 being just meeting the person, 100 being sharing our faith and leading them in a sinner's prayer where they have professed faith in Jesus Christ. But most of the time, God doesn't expect us to go from 1 to 100 in one leap. God expects us that we'll get from 1 to 100 in increments. Maybe we start going from 1 to 10, and then 10 to 15, and then 15 to 27. Meaning 10 to 20, 1 to 10, you're intentional about forming friendships with someone. That gets you from 1 to 10. And then 10 to 20, 10 to 30, 10 to 70 is us being intentional about really developing those relationships. Making time to spend with that person, quality time, listening to them, being for them, supporting them through their problems, abiding with them, and loving them. Even when they're making decisions about their lives that we wouldn't make. When they're making decisions that we just wouldn't go near. When they're living a lifestyle we wouldn't choose. Rebecca Pippert, which is a fun name, Pippert, right? Rebecca Pippert. She's a well-known person who talks about evangelism to the church, because way back in 1979, I was barely alive at this point, she wrote a book called Out of the Salt Shaker and Into the World, in which she talks about this idea of conversational evangelism. And this book got the attention of Christian people all over the world. So Rebecca Pippert has been invited all over the world, literally, pretty much in every continent, maybe not Antarctica, I don't know, but every other continent, she's been invited to come and talk to people about this idea of conversational evangelism. And in her book she writes, "We are not to shout the gospel from a safe and respectable distance and remain detached. We must open our lives enough to let people see that we too laugh and hurt and cry. You want to tell people about Jesus, you've got to get to know them. You've got to be the friend to the point where you're safe being vulnerable with them." What she's saying is we need to be intentional about coming alongside people. We need to be a presence in their lives perhaps a long time before we even get to say anything about Jesus. This is something I've learned and I've experienced in my work with the young people's outreach that we do here on Tuesday evenings. If I were to just walk up to these young people and decide I'm going to have a conversation with them about Jesus, I may even be really good at steering another conversation towards spiritual things, and I get into my whole shtick about Jesus and I tell them all. Well, they might hear it, but they're not listening. They're not getting any of it at all. But I've spent, in some cases, years intentionally developing relationships with some of these young people, caring about their struggles, what's going on in your life, what's going on at home, what's going on at school. Forming that bond of trust and commitment so that now, when we get into a really serious conversation, they'll listen to me when I talk about Jesus in that context. Now, what they do with that afterward, it's not my responsibility. That's between them and God. I can't force them to think and do as I do. But because I've been intentional about forming relationships, I've earned that place in their life to speak Jesus into it. And it usually comes quite easily. I don't have to force Jesus into a conversation. I don't have to beat the conversation in that direction. It just naturally goes that way. Because who I have presented myself to be, they know I'm all sold out for Jesus. and because of the effort I've put into having a relationship with them. You see, sharing our faith with other people requires being intentional. It requires us to be intentional about being friends with people. That's the first thing. The second thing it does require boldness. Eventually, you are going to have to say the J word, Jesus. And this is something we sometimes have a lot of trouble with. Sometimes when it comes to evangelizing, it's like we're playing the old game Password. Who remembers the Password game show, right? There are two players, and the one player has to get the other player to say the secret password. But all the first player can do is give one-word clues to get them to say it, right? So you watch it on TV, and they're all intense about it, right? And like the secret password is White House. And so what do? They sit there and like, President, right? And they like they're trying to, and they don't get it. So then we go through some more rounds. Home. No, we don't get it. Washington. They can't say Washington, D.C. That's more than one word. So they say these words, and they say every word but White House to get the other person playing to let know that what they're trying to talk about is the White House, right? And sometimes that's what we do with Jesus. We say and we do everything around him for people except for say his name. And a lot of times people in the church are under the impression that if they just love someone, well, that's all that's required of them. The hope is that the non-believing person will see Jesus in our actions, and I got to tell you, they do. We love people, we serve them. They see Jesus in our actions. And when we are loving people that way, demonstrating God's love to them, God sees that, and he looks down at us, and he smiles. He loves that. But that's not evangelism. It's what some people would call pre-evangelism. See, you're tilling the soil, you're getting it ready, you're getting it soft. But eventually, you got to plant that seed. You got to say the J word. You have to say Jesus. You must be willing to speak clearly about Jesus, who he is, and what he has done for you and others, how great he is. Take a look at what the Apostle Paul tells us in Romans chapter 10, verse 14. How then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? We got to preach, meaning you must tell the story. Otherwise, how can they know and believe? That's the question the Apostle Paul has. And the unwritten answer he's getting at here is they can't. How can they call on Jesus? How can they have the wonderful benefits of Jesus in their life if they don't believe in him? And how are they going to believe if they have not heard? And how can they hear unless you tell them? We must tell others about Jesus. The great news is that when you've been intentional about investing time to develop relationships with people, then these sorts of conversations just flow naturally. It's not the impossible task. It's just the next step of you just sitting around talking about the things that are important to you with your friend. And what's important to you is Jesus. That's why we always come back to the first requirement. To share your faith, you must be intentional about investing in relationships with other people. That is where most of us fail in our desire to talk to other people about Jesus. The failure doesn't come eventually when it's like, I didn't mention Jesus in the conversation. The failure goes way back to us not being intentional about forming relationships in which Jesus can naturally be brought into those conversations. We've got to be intentional about our relationships. This idea about relationships, this is what Jesus himself did. This is how Jesus drew himself to other people to him. This is how he was doing it. He would get in friendships with people. We think about Jesus and his time here on this earth, and we think about the thousands of people who followed him, the throngs of people, the 5,000. There's so many of them. He had them do a miracle and divide the fish and loaves so he could feed them all. Thousands. Most of them didn't stay with him. Before things even got really ugly, they deserted him. By the end of it, at the foot of the cross, how many really deep, authentic disciples were there? Maybe 11, but who we now know as the apostles. Jesus had spent his life with those 11. Day and night, they were in relationship, sharing himself with them. See, Jesus was intentional about forming and investing in those relationships because it seems that's where faith is shared and passed on. If we're intentional about forming those sorts of relationships, we're setting ourselves up for success. But if we're not intentional, we're setting ourselves up for failure. And that's rebellion against God. You see, we're not going to obey God when he says, tell someone about my son Jesus. We won't do it because we've made it too difficult. I have a story about, maybe 2 months ago. During our Tuesday night outreach with the young people, one of the young ladies who was there, she was just very distant from everyone all night, keeping to herself. And eventually she just went outside and sat to be alone. And she was gone for quite a while, so I eventually went out to see what was wrong, and there was one other person out there with her. And so I sat down and just started talking to her, trying to, ask her, what's going on, what's happening, what's wrong. And she kind of, for a while, talked around things and just said some things to appease me. But eventually, just being there with her, stopping and listening, she opened up about all sorts of horrible things going on at home and at school and things that are difficult for young people to really encounter and deal with. And it was during that conversation that I said to her, I'm sensing that you feel alone. You feel like you've got no help. You feel like no one cares. But I said, Jesus, if you follow him, he'll walk through you with it. He'll give you strength. He'll give you courage to go through it. I'm not saying he'll just take everything away miraculously, but you're not going to go through it alone. He's always going to be there with you if you just follow Jesus. And I didn't have to force Jesus into that conversation. I didn't have to guess whether she's going to be angry that I'm talking to her about Jesus or if she's just going to reject it. Because I had been intentional about having a friendship with her before then. And a friendship that was growing and was real. It was a growing, a loving relationship. So the J word, Jesus, it just kind of floated into that conversation. And all sorts of things about Jesus we talked about in that conversation. And it wasn't difficult. Who do you know in your sphere of influence who really doesn't know Jesus, really is not close to God? How can you be intentional about forming a closer friendship or relationship with that person so that you can love them in the place of Jesus, which is just something he calls us to do in general anyway. Go love them. But also so that you can eventually have a relationship in which you can talk about Jesus and it just flows naturally and peacefully. Who do you know? It's time to get on that. Time to go be intentional about forming that relationship. Because if you don't, you're setting yourself up for failure. You're setting yourself up to feel more guilt for not telling more people about Jesus. That's not how God works. He wants you to know the freedom. But if we don't do this, we're failing before we start. So go find more people to care about. Go find more people to care for, and then go and be intentional about it. Love them, listen to them, and eventually you will tell them about Jesus. Let's pray.